Like so many others, he had become rich by participating in stock companies, which bought the revenues of a province at public auction. By some fluke, or more likely by deliberate connivance, Silva thought, Pomponius Falco had managed to become chairman of his company. During the 5 years of exclusive rights enjoyed by the winning bid, he had squeezed enough income to buy other rights and companies. Now he was supported by his flow of dividends, and no one knew his true wealth. 3 years had passed since he had seen Falco, but if the rumors were true, then he had managed to endear himself with Bernice, who in turn must have persuaded Titus that he should be proclaimed vir perfectissimus, a most excellent man. As a dutiful son, Titus would naturally pass on that impression to Vespasian, who someday might be so ill-advised as to name him vir clarissimus, a most illustrious man. If you had sent word ahead of your coming, I might have been better prepared, Silva said carefully. As it is, I am afflicted with a monstrous head, my gizzard is stiff with verdigris, and my liver frothing with bile. While I officially welcome you to Judea, I will remind you that entrance to my tent, particularly at this ungodly hour of the morning, is subject to announcement and prior appointment regardless of the supplicant's rank. I suggest you return later in the day when I have done with my pressing business. The Numidian was holding out Silva's skirt of leather studded with brass. He buckled it around his waist and pretended he had lost interest in Falco. I will call one of my tribunes, who will see to it that you and your party are made as comfortable as the limited resources of this outpost permit. When Falco replied, Silva heard a touch of deep anger in his normally thin voice. How satisfying! With what dreadful affection did the man embroider his Latin? I am not supplicating anything. I have come a long way, endured considerable expense, and suffered outrageous hardships to bring you the word straight from the emperor. Here is his word. Silva accepted the short roll of heavy paper and forced himself at least to appear indifferent. But I am a poor actor, he thought. While this peacock has made a career of it, no matter what display crosses my face, he must realize it is not every day the hand of Vespasian reaches out so far across the world to touch my own. He broke the seal and read, the Emperor Titus Flavius Vespasianus Pontifex Maximus, holding the tribunician power for the 4th year, acclaimed Imperator 12 times, father of his country, consul 4 times, and designate for the 5th censor, to Flavius Silva, general of the 10th legion, procurator of Judea, greeting. I declare that Pomponius Falco journeys to Judea as our approved envoy. He is to communicate certain vital matters to you and render such assistance as he can to alleviate your situation. I, the Emperor Caesar Vespasian, have signed this. Silva noted the scribbled signature and muttered involuntarily, blah, 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 blah. He caught himself and took a moment to compose his thoughts. Well, it seems you are on some quasi-official mission. However, I am sure Vespasian would understand the routine demands which obligate every soldier at the beginning of the day. When you have delivered his message, will you have the consideration to let me relieve my eyes and organs? Vespasian is annoyed with you. Indeed? Well, I'm annoyed with Vespasian. You would not dare speak those words before him, wouldn't I? I would put it in writing. Do you suppose I consider this a reward? After the battles I have fought for Rome, I am given the most wretched land in the empire, and hold to bring it back to life after we have gone to endless trouble killing it. I assure you this is the only tolerable hour of the Judean day, and very soon even the lizards will complain of the heat. If you can discover any amenity to please either mind or spirit in this desert, I will appreciate you informing me promptly so I may rush to it before it melts. Thus far I have been unable to arrange any opportunity to increase my purse by service in this wasteland, and the other natives are filthier and more irascible than any other we have conquered. We have the Jews in Rome, many of them. They are no problem. Not Jews like these. These are all crazy. The large majority of these people are so devoted to squabbling among themselves they have no time or interest in anything else. Some of them actually took off after a beggar they call the Christ, despite the fact the man was supposed to have died something like 40 years ago. The only industry or agriculture I have so far been able to encourage has been as a consequence of the lash, and I assure you the sight of the Roman to these people is an open invitation to their daggers. Of this wilderness, populated by people who would rather fight than eat, I am supposed to make a Roman republic, and with very little assistance from Rome, I might add. Silva thrust his arms forward with his fists closed. With practiced ease, the Numidian moved around him, strapping on his brass epaulettes and armored jacket. Falco raised a jeweled hand to his ear and toyed with the lobe. He glanced at Tertullus as if he wanted to be assured of his full attention and said, "But General, certainly we cannot deny that Judea is conquered. Triumphs have been celebrated and arches erected to commemorate our victory. Coins have been minted." "So I understand," Silva growled, "and all is well in Judea save for some 900 individuals perched just above the tent who subornedly refuse to admit they are conquered." "That is precisely why I am here. Both Vespasian and Titus are displeased with the situation. Now at last I have some clue why you have come so far. Next I shall be fascinated to learn what you are going to do about it." Vespasian finds it embarrassing that a handful of miserable Jews can so long resist Roman arms. It is difficult to explain in the Senate. You are his legatus. Our esteemed emperor's triumphs were somewhat premature. Are you suggesting this rabble can hold out indefinitely? Silva took a long, deep breath and told himself to chain his patience. A long time ago, a certain Jew called Herod fortified the top of Masada. For his personal comfort, he built 2 palaces up there. He also had a strong sense of the practical and some very clever engineers. He filled warehouses with food enough for thousands of people and preserved it so carefully it is keeping the present occupants of his ruins very healthy. And the soil is such they grow the greens they need. The same Herod built enormous cisterns and took water to them with it from this very hillside via a system of rock channels. If you're trying to confuse the issue, General, I assure you I don't. I know very well that it never rains in the desert. Do you now? Well, I will augment your education to the extent of assuring you that it does, at least enough for Herod to have troubled constructing 2 major aqueducts. We have destroyed both of them, but we are quite unable to do anything about the water already in the reservoirs, which I am informed is in sufficient supply to last them several more years. As for so-called rabble, by which you conveniently identify the people up there, you may better appreciate their stubborn and recalcitrant nature if you also understand they are fighting side by side with their families and are led by one Eleazar ben Yair, who happens to be a very clever and resourceful commander. A sword will not cut stone. I did not come all this way to hear platitudes. You will suffer more than platitudes if you annoy me further. There was a moment's silence in the tent, broken only by metallic clicks as Silva buckled his sword to his right side Legion style. Then Falco said slowly, "Nor did I expect to find our Emperor's deputy whoring with Jewish women." Silva lowered his head and pressed his lips tightly together. He thought, "I am not going to tiptoe around this fawn with fangs any longer. He baits me on the wrong morning, so I am going to kill the bastard right in my own tent." He half drew his sword, then slowly slipped it back into its scabbard. "Keep your temper, winehead. Pomponius Falco does not venture anything without the most careful preparation. More than full protection will be standing by just outside the entrance, and his fancy boy remains in a cubit of the flap. He will certainly scream for aid, and the regrettable death of Flavius Silva, along with his Numidian, could easily be explained by so grand a personage as Pomponius Falco. Poor fellow, discouraged over the inability to conquer Masada, he has fallen on his sword. And there was no use in denying Shiva. Falco undoubtedly knew all about her long before he came to the desert. Mails to Rome might take over a month in transit, but word of mouth flew on wings of a falcon. "She's not a whore," Silva said deliberately. "Ah, then, just a naughty lady, I suppose, privy to the secrets of our military commander in Judea, and therefore able to pass them on to her own people. How convenient! That's ridiculous. You assume there are any secrets in Judea, Roman or otherwise? Nor did I expect to find the man Rome has entrusted with such grave responsibility so sodden with wine he either is incapable or unwilling to properly welcome his emperor's envoy." Silva took a step toward Falco, then another, until he could almost touch him. At last he halted, knowing that if he approached closer he would be unable to resist reaching for his throat. His voice trembled with his anger. "I do not welcome Provenus to my camp. I do not welcome advisors and schemers who come to see a few of my soldiers die so they can return to Rome as experts on the situation. I do not value military advice from those whose battles have been fought in the marketplace. The longest journey you have ever made started on the day your uncle reached into the bowels of his second family, plucked you from the slums of Ravenna, chewed on you for a while, and then spat you out into the sewers of Roman society. I will concede you are a fast traveler, but nothing you have ever done recommends you as a soldier." The Numidian held his helmet. Silver reached for it as Falco said, "You are an uncouth military beast." "Right! Now you will excuse me for my duties. Get some rest and take your little friend with you. He must be weary." I must hide my uneasiness," Silver warned himself. "He is waiting for the slightest hint. I fear him." Silver blew some imaginary dust from the plume of his helmet, tucked it under his arm, and stepped around his two guests. He drew back the tent flap and congratulated himself, for there stood Falco's preparations for any serious opposition. Waiting just outside the entrance, barely a javelin's length away from his own Praetorian guards, was a solid block of perhaps 20 auxilia. Germans from the looks of them. It was now becoming fashionable among men of influence in Rome to employ such barbarians as bodyguards, as well they might. Silver remembered, since they were loyal to their nearest superior and utterly fearless. Silver managed a smile as he turned back to Falco. He spoke with a deliberate Sicilian inflection to his Latin, so his own men would be certain to understand him. "I must say you do travel in style." He glanced contemptuously at the Germans. "I hope you brought enough feed for these animals." He stepped into the scorching sun and was about to advise Falco that he would send an officer with instructions about suitable quarters when he suddenly changed his mind. The great noise had ceased. How long had it been so? He remembered the volume had been normal during his bath, but there had been a little time while he started his dressing. If it had stopped before Falco's arrival, then most certainly he would have noticed it. Silenced in this place meant only one thing. Eleazar Ben Yair was on the wall. Silva clapped his hands in anticipation. He turned his bad eye towards Falco and, smiling, reached for his arm. "Come, Pomponius Falco. I shall demonstrate how thoroughly we have conquered Judea. I will show you something you can take back to amuse bored senators. If the deserts of Judea offer nothing else, you will see we cannot complain of the acoustics." In spite of his limp, Silva set such a rapid pace that all of the procession followed him were obliged to break step frequently and half run until they caught up. It was exactly as Silva had hoped, for all eyes in the encampment were on his visitors as they passed along the Via Principalis, and he saw no reason to enhance their dignity. Once unable to resist the temptation, he had glanced over his shoulders and had seen how they were already panting and dripping with perspiration. The sight was so pleasing that for a moment he was able to ignore the effect of the searing sun on his own wretchedness. It was true, each day it seemed hotter. He tried to concentrate on more agreeable matters. Here now, he reminded himself, who has the present honor of commanding the celebrated 10th Legion? Trajan had let them at Jotapata. Vespasian himself had depended heavily upon them all through the campaign in Palestine. Not bad company. Look at them, regard the special spirit in their very faces. Everywhere in this throng packing both sides of the roadway. Familiar faces. More than 5,000 men in the 10th, 2,000 in this camp alone. Archers, slingers, pikemen, artillerymen, Syrians, Arabians, levies from every province, welded into one indomitable legion. Scattered everywhere throughout their mass were comrades in battle, names you took pains to call out and whose raised hands you returned. Pedanius, Longus, Fabius, Valens, Macius, Eumedes, Metarius Arianus, and Silvius, your blood brother, old Plinius, by what indulgence of Mars are you still alive? Phatingius, Severans, what mischief are you into now, and what name do you call her? Attius, how is your wound? And Lupercus, how goes yours? Calpurnius Cilix, how about sharing your secret with me? They tell me you gamble so cunningly you now own the 10th. Valerius, Paulinius, your scheme for conserving water, well done. Quickening his pace even more, Silva thought, this is Rome. This is the empire, not the exotic softness of the capital, where men are judged as much for their beauty and words as their might. This is Rome, as it is on the morning all over the world. Everywhere, other generals, other legions, other thousands upon thousands of men bear the arms of Rome to keep the empire supreme. The capital is sick. It is afflicted with parasites like those now trotting behind me. They suck at our Roman blood and transform it to pus. There is not a man in this camp, be he the lowest and youngest of trumpeters, who is not more noble than this master vampire at my heels. Silva eased his step because here on the slight promontory he could view most of his camp as well as 3 of the 8 others surrounding Masada. And as always, he found a sense of accomplishment both in the arrangement and efficiency of his master scheme. In planning the camps, he had followed the standard army pattern which he had employed so many times elsewhere. There was no reason to argue with it. The soldiers of Rome long ago had learned how confusion alone can defeat the finest of troops. Hence, an identical camp design had been developed and was followed by units wherever they were in the empire. A freshly arrived recruit knew exactly his place of duty, though an attack might come on his first night. And somehow, though a unit might be camped in the most distant and barbarous land, the very familiarity of the design proved reassuring to officers and men alike. Still carrying his helmet under his arm, Silva halted for a moment to speak with Roscianus Geminus, who was waiting as he did every morning near the tribunal. Here, on every 4th day, Silva mounted and raised dais and reviewed the troops of his own and the adjacent western camp. Here, awards were made, principal punishments assigned, the auspices consulted before battles, and duty orders passed on to the ranks by their immediate commanders. Now he was reminded how frequently he had been censured by more aloof commanders for his easy liaison with the troops. The quickest way to silence such stiff-necks was to evoke the democratic field custom of a long-gone soldier, one Julius Caesar. A pox on those commanders who waited until the final hours before battle, then mounted the dais in grandeur and delivered an oration they hoped would arouse the fighting spirit of their men. The clever haranguers might succeed, but the system was too tricky for Flavius Silva and too vulnerable to unforeseen developments. If you would ask a man to spill his blood in your name, then let him know you are his brother as well as his father. Right, good solid Geminus? And right, that this butterfly falco and his fluttering companions will prove to be an unmitigated nuisance? Could they not at least send us some agreeable company from home? Do our eyes agree there must be 100 people in his retinue, all of whom will have to be fed and given access to our precious water? Geminis, he said aloud, we will have to do something for our valued guest, Pomponius Falco. You will find a place for him and his people. Geminis eyed the assembly with an utmost distaste. We might squeeze one tent in the central court near the command post, he grumbled, but I cannot think where to put the rest of them. Oh, ever-perceptive Geminis, how instantly you recognize a sticky situation without being given so much as a hint of its true nature. Geminis, veteran of the veterans, centurion of the first class of the most honored cohort, the first in the most honored legion, the 10th captain of my Praetorian secret salutes. Geminis blew out his cheeks and exhaled as a man much overtried. Where, Silva wondered suddenly, had the resourceful rascal obtained the garlic? I can smell you from afar, dear Geminis. Have you stolen the precious stuff from your medics who prescribe it mixed with rue and pounded up the oil for scorpion stings? Beware, Geminis. Be prudent of our supply, for it seems we are suddenly host to such a creature. You will have to think of something, Silva said, without the slightest suggestion of urgency in his voice. He was watching Geminis's eyes roving through the company behind Falco, and he pretended to be concerned when Geminis pulled on his beard and snorted. The rest might have to make do outside the walls. I suppose I could chase away some of the Nabatean tradesmen. Pack of thieves anyway. Each of the camps surrounding Masada had its quotes of followers who nestled as close to the Roman soldiers as terrain or the temper of the camp commander allowed. Silva had found them to be much the same in every land, an unwashed mixture of thieves, harlots, mendicants, fakers, merchants whose avarice was no match for their petty wares, and professional beggars who scoured the refuge dumped by the Romans. He had ever been amazed at their ability to survive the most rigorous campaign conditions entirely on their own, quite invisible resources, and it was said in the legions that if your camp followers suddenly disappeared, then you were in very serious trouble. But if they remained as spectators near the field of battle, then a victory was assured. Eyeing Falco's Germans with open suspicion, Geminis asked, "And what am I to do with those northern aborigines, sire, when we have no trees for them to sleep in?" Silva told him to mind his tongue, since they might understand Latin. Geminis shook his great head unhappily, but touched his helmet in obedience. "Where are their tails?" he growled. "I have lived with some vile people in my time, but never with Germans." Silva smiled dryly at the small force now gathered near Geminis. It was becoming a routine assembly, he thought, triggered each time at his pleasure by a Jew with a viper's tongue. There stood young Attius, his aide, obviously shocked at the gaudy spectacle presented by Falco and his darling Cornelius displaying themselves like courtesans before their ensemble of hairy savages. Poor young Attius! A 6 months tribune away from his patrician home for the first time in his life. He had so much to learn he was nearly useless. Technically, he was Geminis's superior officer, but he would no more dare give him an order than Geminis could consider obeying it. With Attius were 10 Arabian archers with their bows at the ready, picked men whose incredible skill was wasted on these affairs. But at least, Silva thought, the Jews knew of their reputation and would keep their distance. There were 3 standard bearers, one holding the sanctified staff of the Legion, which was surmounted by a golden eagle. Instead of a helmet, the bearer wore the skin of a leopard, its jowls opened above his head and the body hanging down his back. Next to him stood a legionary wearing the skin of a wolf in the same fashion. He held a standard with a gilded statue of victory surmounting small portraits of Vespasian and Titus. Rather poor likenesses, in Silva's opinion. Next to the imperial standard was the 10th Legion's staff surmounted by its symbolic wild boar mascot, and then his own standard with an outstretched hand extending from the tip of his principal medals set in vertical order of merit. Silva noticed the gilt was chipped on all 3 standards, and his own highest honor, the Corona Civica, was cracked down the center. Alas, he thought, it has been a long campaign, and it is well the Jews must view us from a distance, else they might perceive how their besiegers are gradually decaying. He put on his helmet and turned to Falco. Do not concern yourself. My armor is like the menagerie, simply to impress the Jews. There is no danger. At these times, Eleazar ben Yair fires much deadlier weapons than arrows. He set off again for the camp's Praetorian Gate, which in accordance with army tradition faced the east. During the taking of auspices, omens favorable to victory were best received from that direction. The procession passed through the gate and turned toward a smaller camp which served as a control point in the great circumvallation that Silva had built around Masada. Here on the western mountain slopes, the wall was relatively simple, but on the eastern side he had caused to be erected 12 towers as lookouts against any possible escape. The wall had done its job. So far as he knew, not a single Jew had managed to escape from Masada, but it had been too costly, and before it had been completed, he told himself that he would never build another. The loss of more than 1,000 Jews in its construction was unimportant, but heat, accident, and disease had cost him 43 valuable legionaries. He did not like to think what it had cost in effort and time. Another of Rome's ideas, he remembered bitterly, long-distance wise men insisting that not a single Jew escape, as if there were any place for them to escape except to death in the desert. Now as he strode alone, well ahead of the others, Silva looked up and frowned at the great rock that had thwarted him for so long. I will give it my bad eye, he thought, and maybe this morning it will fall down. Ah, yes, as soon as the earth stopped turning. There it stood like a gigantic anvil waiting for the hammer of the desert sun. Beyond it lay the Dead Sea and the parched mystery of Moab. This accursed rock had been designed by all the evil gods in company, and with Vulcan as the master architect. It was an enemy you could not blood with spear, bolt or arrow. It was more impregnable than any castle, camp, or fortified city in the world. It is my personal adversary over and above all others. When I defeat Masada, then and only then do I defeat Eleazar ben Yair and his band of Jews. Part 3. Now Silva saw, as he had on so many mornings, how the base of Masada rose out of the deep wadis on the western side and then projected at a steep slant to about half its altitude. Then abruptly the sides became vertical and continued straight upward to the rim. Now as he had since he first beheld Masada. Silva secretly saluted the Jew king. Herod. What a perfect refuge he had chosen if, as he feared, Cleopatra might have persuaded Antony to gift her with Judea. He would also be safe here from the multitude of enemies he had reason to believe were determined to dethrone him. All dead, long ago, but the monuments to Herod's fears were at last employed. There was now only one route to the summit, a narrow, tortuous niching on the eastern face of Masada, known as the Serpent's Path. And for snakes it might do, Silva swore, since no more than one man could pass at a time. Thus 10 men with a few handy stones could hold off 1,000. From his own camp, Silva could see the small palace Herod had built against the face of the northern extremity. There, of course, would be the coolest breezes and almost total absence of the merciless sun, plus what must be a superb view of the Dead Sea and the Judean desert. Silva had thought he might even be able to see the oasis of En-Gedi from such a height, and he had vowed, "There I will take my very best wine and cool my skin once the rock is mine, and Shiva as well? Why not?" He knew the general scheme of the rest of Masada all too well. Any time he pleased, he need only visit the small camp which he had caused to be built facing the southern tip. It was perched on a high plateau at the very edge of the deepest wadi. So steep were the sides of the chasm that it always made Silva slightly dizzy to look down. But if he ignored the awesome wound in the earth and looked across it to the top of Masada, he would tantalize himself with the eagle's view of the defenders. There on the level, Herod had built a larger palace and many storehouses. There were lanes leading from one part of the rampart to another, to the reservoirs and numerous outbuildings, with gates and towers to defend it all. Recently, Silva had resisted any temptation to visit the southern camp. It was too frustrating to watch your enemy, still well-fed and well-watered after over 2 years, walking about as unconcerned as if they had nothing to fear. Looking down upon them, he had once found himself sighing, "Well done," which he knew to be a dangerous admission when applied to any enemy. Nor would the rock leave his mind after darkness came to the desert. Those ever more frequent nights when his loneliness came unbearable and he took solace in the wine, he would sometimes stand outside the tent holding his cup toward the great mass as if it lived and was then only slumbering beneath the stars. Drunk and bemused at its enormous dimensions, he would mumble words at it, reaching out as if he could touch it. "Hail, you sleeping elephant! What would happen if you farted? Roll over, mighty carbuncle on the face of the earth, and dump the Jews in the sea of salt. I will live to crown you, Masada, with a wreath of my urine." Weaving unsteadily in the starlight, his fuddled mind found strange pleasure in remembering that the grandeur and luxury atop Masada, intended for the despot to wait out the revolution, was now occupied by the very sort of revolutionary rabble he had intended to keep out. Silva passed quickly through the small western camp and then its eastern gate, and that formed part of the circumvallation. His head was clearing now. but he was grateful to cross into the shadow of the great rock that stood between the western slopes and the sun. He promised himself that the moment the sun broke over the crest of Masada, he would break off the parley, for he would not, on his wine-soaked morning, or any other morning, stand there squinting up at Eleazar while he enjoyed the sun at his back. It was, of course, no accident that Eleazar never initiated these exchanges during the afternoons when the sun would be in his eyes. The parlays were the problem. Silva had thus far been unable to solve, although he had spent long hours discussing ways the means with his staff. In effect, they were minor battles at which he rarely came away the victor, and if they accomplished nothing else for Eleazar, they held up work on the ramp long before and after their exchange was done. Everything stopped. Before an audience of 20,000 odd slaves and soldiers, a Roman general was obliged to duel in words with a Jewish criminal who had spent his lifetime in rebellion. There was, Silva had reluctantly admitted, no choice. Eleazar had taken full advantage of the peculiarities of Masada, and as the great ramp rose towards him, he pressed harder and harder. His words were his artillery. Because of the remarkable acoustics, his words could bridge the distance between his people and his besiegers and fall where his arrows and stones could not. By his carefully planned speeches, he accomplished the encouragement of his own people and very obviously affected the morale of those thousands of Jews employed on the ramp. Before, during, and long after Eleazar appeared on the heights and shouted his first challenge, the laboring Jews would lie down between the great stones where a whip could not touch them, or scramble to the top of the ramp where the Romans as yet dared venture. The legionary overseers had given up and now stood with everyone else, whips quiet, while they listened spellbound to Eleazar ben Yair, the Sicarius, and Flavius Silva, procurator of Judea. Silva hesitated to estimate how much actual damage these parleys had caused in the morale of his troops. He crossed a dusty wadi, then passed on to terrain which was mostly shale and sand and red boulders scattered across iron-hard earth. How much things of little consequence had come to mean. Now it was like viewing the gardens of Rome to discover a few pitiful wisps of vegetation. He came to the base of the great ramp, which was being built of crushed white stone and rose each day a little farther towards the summit of Masada. The engineers claimed it would be another month before it would extend high enough to erect the assault tower. Another month will take us into April, he mused. That was cutting things very fine. There were always delays and mistakes in any army, if only because rank so rarely matched talent. There was just no time for error here. He found Rubrius Gallus, the tribune, responsible for all the engineering work on the ramp. I could find him, Silva thought, among 100,000 people simply by searching for a lateen sail of a nose. There he stood, all the great height of him, his eyes displaying that permanently injured look as if all the world conspired against him, and then he welcomed it and was determined not to be thwarted regardless of insults to his spirit. There was Gallus hovering over every detail of his enormous project like some finicky pelican searching despondently for something to please him. Gallus, the clever and dedicated road builder who yearned to build for all time while the present need was only for speed. Silva remembered the doleful expression on Gallus's face when he had been instructed to build a ramp in a hurry and had been told it made little difference if it had fell down the day after Masada was captured. Just let me deliver machines at the top, provide a tower 60 feet high and armed with a plate. Inside, give us a ram and we will support it with a brace of catapults to keep Hebrews' heads down. Give me that, dear friend, and I'll have us all on our way out of this desert the very next day. Dear friend? Ah, indeed. What better and more trustworthy friend could any general have than Rubrius Gallus, whose wisdom and heart were perfectly matched by his enormous physique? Who else could listen so sympathetically while you told him of the Jewish Shiva? Who else would not once look down the length of such a great proboscis and proclaim the affair as disgraceful or even ridiculous? Gallus, the one true friend, left in all the world to Flavius Silva. Now Gallus was fretting at the delay. He pointed up at the ramparts of Masada and said, "There he stands, sire. I can accomplish nothing until he is gone." Silva looked up at the diminutive figure high above him. He raised his voice only slightly above normal conversation. He spoke in Greek, which most Jews understood, but his own